So the first question, in an area with coastal development and high wave energy, what are the appropriate design strategies that can protect the built environment and have ecological benefit? So I think all of you probably hit on that. And why don't we kind of, if any one of you wants to kind of take that first question.
Jeff, do you want to bring it back to what you've learned?
And I guess the one element that I would highlight is that it's really important to try to look at the full spectrum of what you might expect. If you're looking at the wave climate over the last 20 years where we have great data, you're probably not capturing the extremes you need to engineer appropriately. So,
Although I would say that you don't want to design for the maximum event. Because if we designed all of our coastal areas for the maximum event, looking at what the prehistoric records show, we would have to design a kind of castle keep along the whole shoreline. And first, we can't afford that. And second, it would eliminate a lot of habitat potentially, unless we did the wall with the habitat on the ocean side, which we could do. But I think that's really important to consider what level of risk we want to be able to incorporate. Some disasters are recoverable. You can recover from disaster. You can't recover from an incremental sea level rise that continues to accelerate. You have to adapt.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, we created this 1.0 system based on a 1 to a 10,000 year flood event. So protecting for the max. But it has caused indeed all these, well, self-created problems. So I totally agree that just going for the max won't do the job, and also will be simply too expensive. I think also your political system is not, well, capable or to do this, and maybe that's a good thing.
I think we'll see a lot more variety in how we respond in adaptation, and that diversity should produce some interesting innovation if we allow innovation to occur. But artificial reefs are a great thing to think about as part of breakwaters. We have some classic artificial reefs in New Jersey made of New York City subway cars and other creative materials. So artificial reefs, I think, are an important part of what we think about for reducing extreme wave heights.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point. I'd love to hear Jeff react to that too, because there is the project of the Blue Dunes, which were on the whole Atlantic seaboard, basically Cape Cod to Cape May, looking at artificial islands. And the critique of that was it wouldn't address sea level rise. It could help with storm surge, but if the seas rise, it's not going to protect. And so I think that's one.
I actually do have an opinion on that.
Sure, let's hear it.
One of the things that proposal misses, I think, is that the natural wave processes are necessary to keep the barriers that we're currently relying on going, right? So if you completely shelter those, they're not getting the wave climate they need to build, right? So you would basically exacerbate the sea level rise impacts in the islands behind those infrastructure, the infrastructure you're putting offshore.
And I just point this out because things are changing, or you would have to embrace the idea of artificially raising those over time.
Sure.
Which is basically the Dutch strategy, to artificially, when people talk about building with nature, I personally really enjoy hearing the Dutch engineers talk about building with nature, because when they talk about that sand engine project, they say it's building with nature.
Yeah.
But they say it's the glacier that they're imitating, not, the day-to-day process of rainfall and wave energy. So you have to think big and be willing to embrace a somewhat Sisyphean task. The sand goes away, you go and get it, you put it back. The sand goes away, you go and get it, you put it back. And I think that's going to be much more a part of a kind of placement industry that's developing in the United States.
If you're willing to pay for that, yeah. I mean, if you've got the resources, you could do that.
Okay, I'll move on. We've got a couple notes and comments, so I think this is actually for Judy, but the comment was, any chance any of you, of the presenters, would share a PowerPoint presentation? So I'm not sure if those will be posted online or if those will be available.
I'm not sure yet, but
Okay.
we will have the videos of all of the presentations up shortly once they're edited properly and so forth. So,
Okay. Another comment was, Kristian, good luck in the World Cup.
Do we need good luck?
You need Ben Percy.
That was not in Spanish. I'm getting a lot of
Well,
questions now, so we did make up some time, but a lot are coming in. I think to kind of the discussion we just had, where are the resources to do it? When we look at some of the projects, that Blue Dunes proposal was a $20 billion project. And the question here is, how do you propose that communities or nations with fewer financial resources adapt?
Well, I think there's a major ethical question at stake here. I mean, that's something I talk about with my European colleagues. They say, for example, Rotterdam has a plan to make itself climate-proof, and that term is being used as a way of attracting investment and raising people's expectations and willingness to invest, but none of us are climate-proof. If our economic partners, our supply chain for manufacturing, human beings who otherwise will migrate to our borders, if that's all happening, none of us is climate-proof. So it does seem to me there's an ethical issue about developed countries spending money on less developed nations and helping them to figure out how they're going to adapt in a way that fits within their resources, augmented by international funds. And there is a plan on the table to do that. There are monies that have been committed by the United States and other nations. And it's not clear yet how those monies will be dispersed, if they'll be given to the governments, in which raises fears of corruption, or they'll be given to corporations, which raises fears of corruption. So it's not clear yet how that money will be distributed.
Yeah, I think we also have to be sensitive, for instance, communities in Vietnam or in Asia where they also have been exposed to these kind of disasters, but they, in many places, they still have an adapted lifestyle. They have a water-adapted lifestyle, and I think we also have to learn from those kind of communities and types of behavior that not only think in, and that's what we as Dutch, and I plead guilty here, always tend to do is come up with a solution, a levee or a wall or whatever. But sometimes it can also be on more microscopic level by thinking of floating communities, thinking of smart reuse of water facilities. So, I don't have all the numbers, of course, on the top of my head, but we have to be much more sensitive to other types of solutions than the ones we now are accustomed to.
A couple questions, one for Jeff. Does the sedimentary record show a bias for tropical storms versus nor'easters? There's a couple. For example, does the winter beach profile make overwash seem smaller than a similar storm in summer? How about ice? And what's the bigger risk for developed and undeveloped coastlines, tropical storms or nor'easters? So it was about a 5-part question.
Right,
for
yeah.
I'll repeat anything if you
Right.
missed it.
The nor'easters turn out, if you remember the histogram I showed, they're fairly minor events in terms of coastal flooding. At least they have been over the last few hundred years, where we typically will get a meter and a half of water level rise, something like that. It's not to say they're not a big deal. They cause coastal erosion. There are some minor breaches in the beaches typically. These hurricanes are very different in that you're looking at 2, 3, 4 times as much inundation and much bigger waves on top. And so rather than just these small little breaches, you're actually getting inundation of the entire barrier and transporting a considerable amount of sediment landward during these events. So in that respect, the nor'easters, from a geologic perspective, are doing a lot less work per event. And when we've been doing these reconstructions, we are basically finding that it's really only the most extreme hurricanes that are doing this work. It's not the nor'easters. If we find a really sensitive site, we might find a little trace of a nor'easter. For example, in New Jersey, when this first came about and the reinsurance industry was like, we really want to know about New Jersey and New York, I was skeptical that it would work because they get so many nor'easters impacting there. But we got into those systems, and it turned out that the biggest nor'easter of the 20th century was the Ash Wednesday storm in the mid-60s. Occasionally we'd find small little traces of sand, like centimeter sort of scale from that. And then just a few decimeters down, we'd find these huge overwash bands that related to these big hurricane events. So the thing with the nor'easters, though, is that they occur much more frequently. And so if you're dealing with a barrier island and you've got a big erosion issue, sea levels rising, that's going to, be a big problem. But if you're thinking of these larger scale, sandy sort of inundation events impacting something like Boston or New York City, I think it's really the tropical cyclones that are probably the much bigger player. Though as we continue to flood with sea level rise, nor'easters will get more and more important. I can't remember the other 4 parts of the question.
I think you covered it.
No, very good.
Question for Kristina. Several of the projects involve trading aquatic habitat for marsh uplands. Is the regulatory structure in California conducive to this? I worry that mass regulations will not make this plausible. Want to touch on that?
There is nothing in the regulatory structure of California which makes any of this possible. Luckily, the Bay Conservation Development Commission is the local coastal commission in the Bay Area. And so they are able to encourage pilot projects, and there have been some, to build artificial beaches, certainly to build wetlands. They've rebuilt 47,000 acres plus, and the target is in the 80,000 acre range or 100,000 acre range. There's been a lot of work to reestablish wetlands, and more recently to use waste sediment from gravel mining to build artificial beaches. So the Bay Area Conservation Development Commission gives out the permits, and they are interested in doing this work and seeing it experimented with. But in terms of trade-offs on habitat, when we look at the projections for sea level rise, if it gets to 1.25 meters, we'll lose 96% of all the intertidal wetland without intervening. So all the chips are on the table, and the question is, how do we play our hand? I think there's going to have to be a summit of all the people who do the regulation, and we need to do some adjustments of some of the laws, which will not be pretty.
I think to kind of add on to that, I think California is probably one of the most difficult states, if not most difficult areas in the world to regulate a project. Entitlements take on average about 17 years to get a project approved in the state, and it's open to a lot of lawsuits at any angle. And I think there's a realization of those challenges. And I think Kristian's project, Rebuild by Design, really looked at that. It was organized by the Rockefeller Foundation with the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force to look at trying to cut through some of these barriers because of some of the multiple layers of bureaucracy that don't allow innovations to occur. And that was ultimately what Rebuild was looking to do, was innovations and resilience. So,
but I think that there are experiments happening around the U.S., and we have to stop saying we're not doing it and start adding up what that list is and talking about which agencies, which people are allowing this to happen, because those people are brave, and they need to get some reward for the risks that they're taking to help us explore, whether they're at the Army Corps or at state coastal commissions or wherever they are. We need to support them and help that happen with private sector investment or political recognition or something.
I can confirm that these small experiments have been done in the Netherlands successfully also. So, yeah.
It just hasn't bubbled up to a
No,
state or
it's just
national
on a micro
stage.
level still.
Yeah.
Kristina showed the Living Reefs project on the north shore of Raritan Bay, protecting Staten Island. And that project was in Staten Island and there because New Jersey is regulated against that and the inability to do oyster farming there, and looking at that for what the potentials are with it. So you do see a lot of opportunities where it's kind of navigating where some of these opportunities allow this to happen. To another question, for Donnelly, what caused the higher sea surface temperatures hundreds of years ago that correlated with hurricane extremes back then?
What it looks like is that East Coast anomaly I pointed to in sort of the 15th to 17th century looks like it's related to Gulf Stream flux. And so it's probably related to what they call the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And so that's where you are getting more deep water formation forming in the North Atlantic, and it's basically a big conveyor belt. So you're accentuating the Gulf Stream transport at that time. Initially, it was very puzzling because that's as we're transitioning from what we call the medieval warm period into the Little Ice Age. And so we're supposed to be getting colder, and yet we're seeing the hurricanes light up along the eastern seaboard of the U.S., but it turns out it's this local or regional sea surface temperature anomaly that's related to this Gulf Stream transport that's actually resulting in that. And what's related to the deep tropical warming that we see a little bit earlier on, between about 2,000 years ago and about 1,000 years ago, That's actually, we're not quite sure what the forcing is, but it's related to where the intertropical convergence zone is. And so you get this warming over the deep tropics, you get much more tropical convection, and those are the seedlings for these tropical cyclones to get started.
We have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and go lightning round so we can hit as many as we can. Kristian, what was evolution like from hard structures to hardened green infrastructure in Holland?
Well, it's, as I tried to explain, it's going on parallelly. So on the one hand, we are still building hard infrastructures when we need to. Sometimes simply the space doesn't allow us to come up with more comprehensive solutions because, well, these take space, as you have seen from the examples. But on the other hand, you see them happening next to one another, that enhancing the hard infrastructure is also coupled with adding green infrastructure, but also adaptation strategies in inland. And I think those are not too much addressed because currently we're facing in the Netherlands, but also I can see that here in America, that these heavy rainfalls and dealing with the rainwater is even a bigger issue, an underestimated issue, in combination with the storm surges. So, we're really reinventing our own system currently and adding up new layers of intelligence, I would say, and learning from nature as well.
Okay, I'm going to make this the last question unless we get through this quickly, but I think it's a good segue to lunch because it's going to generate a lot of discussion over lunch. But yesterday we heard from local leaders and policymakers that they had no precedents for their task in developing adaptive long-term planning, zoning, and community plans. I think we just heard so. What are your ideas for the disconnect between the design planning community and the policymakers, local citizens, for access to information, self-education, and international precedents?
Well, I think the Rebuild by Design competition is a good example of how to reach out to the public and to policymakers with some physical planning and design ideas. And similar things have happened in other parts of the country. The Dutch Dialogues process that I helped with in New Orleans was a similar example. And in the Bay Area, there was the Rising Tides 1 competition, which produced some kind of cockamamie ideas along with some good ideas. But that's still an important process of letting people see what ideas could come out of it. And I hope that the new competition here in Boston will be a way to reach out to people. But we need to figure out how to get this into more the media that people are aware of. And
I think kind of to add on to that too, just over the weekend, President Obama announced through the Obama Climate Resilience Fund, that's $1 billion that's been set aside, but that's looking to other municipalities to have more competitions to look at innovations in resilience, whether it's sea level rise or storm surges, or it could be wildfires, not wildflowers, or earthquakes or drought. So I think there's a lot more that you can see, and even just Crystal announcing this morning the competition with TBHA this morning.
could I say one quick thing about
Sure.
that? I think it's important as we talk about the processes that we're facing and the magnitude of some of these processes and the changes and the costs, that we remember that people have a fatigue about that. And that there's a point at which you can't hammer them again and again with the bad news, and you have to offer something else. And the physical design ideas that we've talked about are something else. It's not the only something else. So I think it's important to always see them both together. And I had this experience with one of the mayors in Marin County who was depressed about all the sea level stuff that was happening, and she was very confused, and she'd been going to all these meetings and looking more and more haggard and thinking, what's going on? And after I talked to her about the Hafen City project in Hamburg and some other ideas for the Marin shoreline, she said, you mean we could thrive while this change happens? And while there are lots of problems, and thrive may not exactly be the word globally, as markets tank over and over again and migration issues happen, I think it is important to include a hopeful message about how we can build in a way that really is smarter, more adaptive, and inspires us. And to be able to combine that with the serious news about what's happening.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers and just as we'll have a break for lunch right now. We'll be reconvening at about 1:30. I know we have some of the afternoon panels and kind of a closing note. I know Cairo Shen, the Director of Planning for the BRA, is one of the speakers this afternoon, looking at planning and implementation. And I do have some of these cards from the Sea Change Boston exhibit. And at that opening, Cairo's talked about it. He said, I'm here, I'm looking at this data about sea level rise and the impacts on Boston, and it's a lot of gloom and doom, but there's a lot of great strategies out there. We know what it is. There's great examples from around the world, and the key is that we need to start acting on that initiative and starting to address that future impacts of sea level rise. Thank you.